have an event last Friday on business and human rights with tour operators, which was planned to be the major activity for me. And then I said, well, but it would be so great to get to know all of you and to attend Alba Sud summer school. We were thinking what I could contribute, because I'm not a scientist. I'm not working in a university. So I thought, understanding that you are not only interested in academic exchange, but also in transformative approach, in connecting knowledge with activism, academia and activism, as Macià was explaining yesterday, I thought I'd bring in one very, very small piece of a larger picture on how to bring companies to accountability for human rights violations along their supply chain. So that's the topic I will speak about. It will be nothing about transforming tourism. It will be not the contra vision of tourism development. It will just be a vision on how to avoid and to reduce the impacts of companies on human rights for the people, and a little bit on environmental protection as well. As I'm not coming from a university, I thought that I speak at the beginning a very small part on the work that I'm doing, how I'm working, because maybe you are more familiar with someone coming from a university and you have a picture in your mind how persons are working. So there will be 3 slides on work I'm doing, just to give you an overview, and then I will go into this new legal developments, mainly on the German supply chain law, but what will be more important globally is the proposal for an EU supply chain law, which I would introduce and explain a little bit which cases would fall under it, how it could be used to bring in knowledge, research in a process that will start a process of analyzing the behavior of companies by states. So I think there's a small opportunity, hopefully, which would enter to bring knowledge into change for the people negatively affected by human rights violations along the tourism supply chain. Well, you see the topics that we try a little bit to work on, all on a very kind of superficial level, because actually I'm one person. I have some people who are supporting me on freelance basis, but basically I benefit from being part of a larger organization and understanding a little bit things from other points. So we are talking about human rights, which includes the right to participation, not only economically, but also political participation. Which kind of tourism do we want to have? How many numbers of tourists we want to welcome? So it's a little bit connected to what you explained. Climate justice, another dimension, which has also to do with the climate impacts of tourism, but also with the inequality in producing a climate footprint in comparison from people coming from rich countries in comparison to people in economically poorer countries. Fair trade and economic empowerment, so strengthening SMEs, getting possibilities for own entrepreneurship, for integration of smaller businesses is one part. And then responsible travel, which is more about informing tourists about how to travel in a fair way. As I said, I'm part of a larger organization, which is Pan para el Mundo, Bread for the World, which is a church-based development agency. So we are supporting projects, 1,500 projects, more or less, in countries of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. We are not implementing ourselves. That's very important from our own identity, that we are not implementing development projects, but that we are financially supporting self-help organizations on the local ground who are proposing projects. We are trying that they are meeting with our financial requirements, etc. But then they are very free to develop those initiatives, those activities that they are focused on. But I'm located at the political department of Bread for the World, because in our understanding you cannot overcome hunger and poverty if you are only looking at people in poverty. You have to talk about power relations, you have to talk about who is making decisions that are affecting people to stay in poverty. So we have a political department which is mainly trying to influence decision makers in Germany in the field of trade politics, climate politics, social protection floors, environmental issues, and as well tourism. Yes, our three instruments, we have like three sales or three pillars we are active in. One is public relations work, education, doing seminars. Sometimes we have a second pillar, which is strengthening civil society networks worldwide. This is something where we are cooperating with Alba Sud, for example, to strengthen the exchange between civil society organization, tourism critical groups all over the world. And this is the main part of our work, which is advocacy and policy dialogue towards the German government, but also, and this is my speciality, to influence and advocate against tour operators. So I have no clue about the hospitality sector, I have no clue about gastronomy, but I have some speciality on tour operators, which many of them are based in Germany with their headquarters, so there's a direct sphere of influence, right? This is my last English slide. The next one will be in Spanish, and I hope that I will not mix up everything. Actually, this was a presentation that my colleague, who is a lawyer and who is working on business and human rights in a more general way, was giving towards civil society organizations in Bolivia, Chile, and Peru in the lithium triangle, where lithium is exploited, to get local groups who are politically active understanding which opportunities come with this new legal framework that we are having. So where are we today? Actually, I have to go back. I could start with the General Declaration on Human Rights in 1948, which was already mentioning that third parties have a responsibility for human rights. But anyway, not much happened. Third parties could be like companies or individuals, so non-state actors, basically. Nothing happened. Globalization started in the 70s, 80s, 90s. Companies were having the power and influence of some smaller states, but there was no legal framework under which the responsibility of companies is explained. So after a long process, I will just make it short, there was like a conclusion which was defining this protect, respect, remedy framework, which says that states have the responsibility to protect people's human rights, that companies have a duty, an obligation. It's an obligation to respect human rights. So you see, it's not more a duty; it's an obligation. It's weaker. It's not the protection, but the respect. So you see, it's still framed in the very conventional human rights system that the states have the primary responsibility for human rights. But it was explaining what companies have to do to comply with their human rights responsibility. And then there's a third pillar, the remedy framework, which is saying that governments as well as non-governmental actors have to provide access to remedy and stop human rights violations once they are getting aware of it. So this UN guiding principles on business and human rights are general, are global. They are applying to all companies, all sectors, all size of companies, but they are non-binding. It's just like, we expect companies to act according to this framework. But what is strong is that it clearly describes the concept of due diligence. So what practically does it mean that a company introduces a management system to comply with their human rights responsibility? Well, what happened after 2011 is that many countries developed so-called national action plans on business and human rights, which are usually voluntary instruments. So governments are describing their expectations towards companies. Some are stronger, some are not so strong. Latin America is quite strong on this. Many countries having introduced those national action plans. In the European Union, it was like an obligation from the EU that every member country has to develop a national action plan. And right now, and this is the process that I will describe on the example of the German supply chain law, we are coming from this voluntary thing to a more binding legislation, which not only describes the expectations, but also describes the penalties if a company is not meeting these requirements. Looking at Europe, there are different supply chain laws right now. Actually, from this analysis, I'm not sure why the UK are not mentioned as a country with a supply chain law, because they have a Modern Slavery Act, but maybe it seemed to be, from the qualitative basis, a little bit different from a supply chain law, but this Queen's speech that you heard, I think, 3 weeks ago, is now also starting a process that a proper due diligence law will be developed in the UK as well. But you have some in France. The France due diligence law is quite strong, but it only is only like 100 companies are applicable to this law, because it has very high numbers of employees and benefit that this company has to gain to fall under this law. But actually it's a good law, but just only for a very small, tiny number of companies. I think 129 I read one day. So we have the Netherlands, they have a quite good supply chain law, but only focus on child labor. But also now they are developing it further. Germany has a supply chain law, which I will explain a little bit in more detail. But it's the Ley de la Cadena de Suministro. I will just call it supply chain law. It has a long title, but anyway, that's the shorter one. So what happened in 2011, the EU was saying, well, every member country should develop a national action plan, so nothing happened. It took until, I think, the day before Christmas in 2016 until the German government decided, well, we are having a national action plan. 5 years they were not even able to identify a ministry which would have the lead in this process. So it was very late, but we had a national action plan, but it was voluntarily. It was just describing the expectations towards companies. In 2018 we had elections, and during the negotiations for the governmental plans, they said, well, we will test if companies are meeting our obligations, and if not, we will develop a legal instrument, a legislation. So in 2020 they tested, and it was less than every fifth company which had a minimum standard of due diligence management strategies. In tourism, I would say I know all the companies. There were some, maybe 3, 4, who would meet the requirements, but they were like small companies. So those who this national action plan was addressing, I think none of the tourism companies was meeting these requirements. Anyway, so they decided to have a legal system, a law, which was decided then in 2021 and which now comes into practice in 2023. I'm speaking too long.
No, it's okay, it's okay. I was listening.
Okay.
This is what my face.
Well, what is this supply chain law basically saying? It's a long document with 30 pages. I just realized that I don't have it with me if there are some specific questions. But anyway, in very general, it should become active on January 23, so quite soon. It will be applied to companies generally with more than 1,000 employees. And for the first year, it will only apply for companies with more than 3,000 employees. So it's also a very small number. And when we are looking at the tourism tour operators in Germany, it will be about 4 or 5, maybe 6, who would need to follow this legislation. There are some other indicators for which company this is, but generally the number of employees. Well, it describes the due diligence along the supply chain, and also describes not only human rights obligations, but also some very limited environmental standards. And there's a control authority which is to be developed now. Now they are hiring staff. They are trying to think, okay, how do we control? But there will be a control mechanism which will control companies if they are having those management standards in place that due diligence concepts describe. What is this? Practically, a company has to develop a strategy on human rights. It has to make an analysis of human rights risks, real existing risks, but also potential risks along the supply chain. It has to integrate the strategy into the company's culture, so it has to train the staff, it has to integrate it in contracts with suppliers, etc., etc. There's also an obligation for a remedy instrument in companies, which is quite interesting because it has to be reviewed, and at the next point every year, which honestly I think is quite strict, because in 1 year you have to control every year. But anyway, it's not only a control about the effects, but also about the effectivity of the remedy mechanism, for example. Well, this is very briefly what fields of human rights are covered. You have child labor, you have modern slavery, you have forced labor, you have an ignorance of labor protection, which includes much of those things that you discussed yesterday and today as well. Also, the ignorance of the liberty to form unions and to have collective bargaining is part of this law. Also, the discrimination in the workplace, being it in the process of hiring people, but also when you're working with people, it's the retention of a minimum wage. Unfortunately, it's really only talking about minimum wages, and then they are talking about the workers' laws in the destinations. So it's not the German standards, but the standards in the destinations. There are also some violences against human rights through degradation of the environment, which is, for example, excessive use of water. If a company is using so much water that the population has no access to a quantity of water to live in dignity, this would be, for example, one of those reasons. We have displacements, which is also very important, mentioned as a human rights risk. And then we have something of violence of forced security forces, which is also a topic in the hotel sector and along the supply chain of tour operators. We have some environmental risks, but they are very, very technical and not related to tourism at all. I think I don't have to refer them. Well, where does this human rights law, this supply chain law helps? These are some real cases. It's not tourism, because this is a presentation from my colleague and I didn't want to just change the names, but I think we can all imagine those human rights cases happening in tourism. So for example, here it is the rights of the workers. They have to use like pesticides, so it's a lack of protection of health and safety at the workplace. Here we have a park that is construido and where local indigenous communities are displaced, so this would be covered. Or we have here the use of security forces in a country which is famous for having uncontrolled and high levels of violence in the private security sector. You can have the presentation later if you want.
Yes, it's just for...
Okay, and this is the point that I wanted to make, and now I really think I have to hurry. But every company has to develop a compliant mechanism. It has to have a complaint mechanism. And this complaint mechanism must be open not only for the employees at the company, but also for people living in the destinations, for example. How good it will work, we will see, but anyway, they have to have something like this. Then we have now a mode that people who are affected by human rights violation can inform this control body in Germany, and then the control body has to become active if they get notice of something. And there's new possibilities for unions and for civil society organizations to represent local people affected by human rights violations by German governments in front of German courts. Before, people had to travel to Germany, which was always a severe challenge for people affected. Farmers could not come to Europe for 3 weeks just to attend a court session. Yes, so that's the point, but we see this is one point, there's still no responsabilidad civil. So it's only like a compensation for harm that was caused, but not a civil responsibility. Our second point of criticism is that only a very small number of companies are addressed, and that we have a problem that this due diligence is mainly focused on the direct suppliers. And for the indirect suppliers, or for the longer, broader supply chain, the law is saying if a company is aware of any knowledge that a specific, for example, that in the cleaning of clothes, that there are children in a country working in the lavadoras, I'm mixing the languages now, then they have to follow this up. So this would be an entry point also to present analysis. Well, and now this is my last slide. I'm really coming to a point now. Since February 2022, the European Commission has developed or has presented a proposal for a supply chain law, and the interesting is the title, because it's saying it's la Directiva sobre la diligencia debida de las empresas en materia de sostenibilidad. Entonces, this is not only on human rights, like the German supply chain law, but it also explains due diligence for the environment. So it has reflections to biodiversity, to climate change, etc., etc. And that's the positive point. It applies to a higher number of companies with more than 500 employees, which at least in tourism would mean all the large hotel chains in Europe. All the 22 operators alone in Germany would be affected. All aviation companies, etc., would be falling under this law. And there are more human rights risks explained, for example, also the accommodation of workers at the site, which Giselle today explained. So this is a field where a company has to become active, and it's also talking about a salario decent or a fair living wage, and not only a minimum wage. And we have environmental risks. For example, it's connected to the Convention on Biodiversity, and it would mean that companies have to develop plans for reduction their emissions in line with the 1.5 limit agreed in the Paris Agreement. And the best thing is, if this comes into practice, every country, every member country in Europe has to develop due diligence laws that are meeting those requirements. So it's a legislation, it's a directive, which means that existing laws have to be further developed, or countries who have no laws yet must develop laws in the mean of 2 years. Well, and these are some links just for the Spanish documents. Maybe you find it interesting to read a little bit more into detail in these things. That was it.